Hello and welcome to GreenTV. I'm Tom Brown, your host today. GreenTV is brought to you by the St. Joe Valley Greens in South Bend, Indiana. Please check out our website and come visit us. Investigative journalism is hard work, legally and financially risky, even dangerous. Greg Palast is probably the greatest investigative reporter you've never heard of. He works for the British Guardian newspapers and has a column in The Observer. He also hosts BBC Television's Newsnight. In 1999, Palast reopened the investigation into the Exxon Valdez tragedy and pointed a damning finger at British Petroleum and Alyeska, the Alaskan pipeline company. Palast was a power industry investigator in the 80s and in the 90s revealed how Houston Gas and Oil, operating under the alias Enron, persuaded Margaret Thatcher to deregulate energy production in the UK, the first such deregulation in the hemisphere. Deregulation fever arrived in the U.S. and plunged us into pre-1933 looting of energy consumers' pockets. In 1989, Palast did the initial investigative work which laid bare corporate thievery in the California energy industry, and which led to the eventual fall of Enron and Arthur Andersen. Palast broke the story on the systematic voting fraud in Florida in 2000, which abetted the theft of the presidency. Since then, Palast has concentrated on the biggest threat yet to democracy, targeted voting fraud made possible by massive computer databases and electronic voting machines in the service of crooked politicians. If you don't watch GreenTV for the rest of this year, you must absolutely see our next two shows. Now, here's part 2 of Greg Palast's talk, Floridagate and Beyond.
According to agents from not only, these were low-level agents of the FBI. There were also, we spoke with, when I say we, BBC Television, spoke with high-level people in the CIA, DIA consortium, National Security Agency consortium, who told us that they were told before September 11th, you can't look at Saudi Arabian financing of terror. That's a no-go area. Now, it may be for intelligent, political, policy reasons. You know, we don't want to disturb the guys sitting on our oil spigot. You have to understand how the Saudis, you know, whatever reason is, I'm not going to try to impute anything to it. But I was very interested in one thing that wasn't, what were they told not to look at? I asked for some specific things. Well, one thing that I found interesting is that BBC learned, and we confirmed this from 2 completely separate sources, that there was a meeting in Paris in May, June 1996. I have the exact location, I have the list of participants, in which arms dealers and Saudi Arabian billionaires got together and decided how much money would go to various Islamic Wahhabi charities, and including how much would go to Al-Qaeda. Not that they were in love with Al-Qaeda, but it was at the time of the Khobar Towers attack, 19 U.S. servicemen were killed by Al-Qaeda in Saudi Arabia. And it was, how much do we have to pay you to go play somewhere else? Now, it was not intent then. There is no information from that meeting that they intended to fund Al-Qaeda to attack the United States. But once you fund that organization, and you tell them to go play in Afghanistan and play in Uzbekistan, it's not completely out of line to imagine that some of them may end up taking flying lessons in America with no intent of landing. The question is, why weren't we following this down? This raises some uncomfortable questions. Not again about Bush knowing in advance about September 11th attack. Literally, I have no information on that, and none implied. What is implied is that there was a prejudice toward investigating the funders of terror even if they were inadvertent funders of terror. You can't find out what Osama bin Laden is up to unless you check his checking account. It's the oldest rule in the biz. Follow the money. And the agents were told, don't follow the money. So I was interested, by the way, in who was in that meeting. It was only in the last couple of weeks that among the names of those people in the meeting from two separate sources was one Sheikh Abdullah Bakhsh. So if we weren't looking, maybe there were reasons not to look. What I was very concerned about also, I asked an agent what specifically was blocked by this kind of prejudice against bothering the Saudis. Again, it was not an attempt. There is no information that Bush was intent on permitting an attack upon the United States. That's a wrong way to go. Think of it this way: it is about a prejudice towards allowing certain groups off the hook. In other words, so, for example, I said, what investigations were stopped? And one was the investigation of Khan Industries, according to a CIA operative who was talking to BBC. And we were able to confirm this from a second source. What is Khan Industries? It turns out these are the characters that were building an atomic bomb for Pakistan. Now, when I heard Colin Powell speak at the United Nations, he said, we cannot allow, in fact, by the way, you know, in Pakistan we do have a dictator named Musharraf, who's a fanatic, was a close supporter, if not creator, of the Taliban government in Afghanistan. He's got an atomic bomb, and he's threatened to use it. So when Colin Powell got up in front of the United Nations and said, we can't allow some berserk dictator with an atomic bomb to threaten the planet, I turned to my wife, I said, my God, we're going to invade Pakistan. And then he said Iraq, and it's like, wait. And it turns out, we're going steady with Musharraf. You know, we have all these pictures of George with his arm around him, it's like those prom date pictures, you know. So, you know, your nuclear berserker is a matter of taste. And by the way, how do we know that Saddam has fixins in his basement for has some type of nuclear erector set in one of his 50 palaces? The answer is that we did have, also BBC got a hold of documents from a defector, from the Saudi diplomat who defected. And he brought 14,000 documents over, offered them to the FBI, which said, we're not allowed to look at them. Their lawyer said, we'll pay for the photocopying. This is true. We'll pay for the photocopying. Get some bad guys. You know, like, there's stuff in here about, including, that the Saudis gave $7 billion to Saddam Hussein to build an atomic bomb. That's maybe why we think he has something. But this was, when did he get that money? It was cut off before he finished his program. When did he get that money? It was during the Reagan-Bush administration, when, don't forget, at that time, this was before the axis of evil. At that time, we had Iran, the unicycle of evil, right? And you know, because we were looking around, it was kind of post-Soviet era, we're looking for that new enemy, and there was Iran. And Saddam, in fact, the most interesting thing I heard this week was when Condoleezza Rice said on NPR, and the reporters are just nodding their heads like this, like, you know, those Bobby dolls, that, you know, she says, it's terribly immoral that we've allowed Saddam Hussein to stay, this maniac to stay in power for these past 12 years. And I'm thinking, wait, Saddam Hussein has been in power for 24 years. But for the first 12 years, we were going steady with him. You know, it's like, he was our, you know, our bad man with weapon of mass destruction. Well, yeah. It's like, so I hope you've been paying. Is this meeting been approved by the Uniting and Strengthening America Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism Act? Which is, by the way, what the USA Patriot Act stands for. Let me read that again. The Uniting and Strengthening America Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism Act. Tools? Like Bob the Builder? Tools? What tools? Tools for fools? Tools. The tools are to be created by an agency called DARPA. And the program is Total Information Awareness. Now, technically, that program was killed by a combination of progressive Democrats and kind of frightened right-wingers figuring if they get enough information, they're going to take away our gun. You know, so technically TIA, Total Information Awareness, was killed by the U.S. Congress and resulting in not one contract being canceled. Now that's headed by a guy named John Poindexter. Now it did have a logo, which was a pyramid with an all-seeing eye, like appropriately what you see on the back of a dollar bill. And actually, it's not really, people thought it was their logo. Actually, it's a portrait of Poindexter as this like one big eye in the middle of his head. So who is this guy? The Washington Post said of John Poindexter, this is from the Washington Post, he figured prominently in the Iran-Contra scandal. Figured prominently, he was convicted of 5 felonies. It's true that they were overturned on technicalities, but the interesting thing is what he was convicted of, which was to aid and abet the irregular forces killing civilians to overthrow an elected government, which under the USA Patriot Act is terrorism. So, you know, just like, I guess the administration's idea is it takes a thief to catch a thief, so to catch a terrorist, you need a John Poindexter, you know? So this is who's in charge. Now, what they have is that there is a company that has a massive database of 20 million data points on all Americans. But not much use to have a big bunch of data unless you can mine that data. So there is a product called Genoa 2. And it is made by a company called Syntech, which is kind of a combination of original sin and high technology, Syntech. And that's gotten the big contract from DARPA for Total Information Awareness. And it's, by the way, did I mention the senior vice president of Syntech was John Poindexter? Now, I'm not saying that there's any self-dealing going on in this administration, but no, he didn't give his own company the contract. That was given to him by a guy named Sharkey, Brian Sharkey, who was Poindexter's predecessor as head of DARPA. And when Poindexter got in, he gave a big contract to Hicks and Company, whose new senior vice president was Brian Sharkey. So it's kind of total contract awareness. But you know, there's, by the way, all banks are required to modify their computer records so that they can combine with this other company's 20 billion database data points. This is in the USA Patriot Act. Each bank must have this computer patch system, which is funded by a guy named Marvin Bush. Now, if you were paying attention, junior investigative reporters, you would know that the question to ask is, who is this company with the 20 billion pieces of information on we Americans? Was it more than the FBI? So that takes us back to the presidential election of 2000. Wait a minute. I have to be careful even bringing that up because, you know, I know what some of you are saying. We shouldn't go there. Catherine Harris has told us to get over it. And our president has told us to move on. Though I'm kind of interested in that, like, what do you get over when you're over democracy, you know? And what do you move on to? What is it you move on to when, you know, when you moved on from elections, you know? It's like, I'm not quite sure I like what we've moved on to, but you know, I mean, okay. So I'm going to move back for a minute, and I just wanted to mention that when I was back to the 2000 election, because when I was in Britain, and I was off for the night, BBC, my program, BBC Television Newsnight. I'm watching the program for a couple of days at home, and I see these black faces coming up on the BBC television screen saying, you know, I tried to vote in Florida, but I was told I couldn't. I was a criminal. I knocked off a 7-Eleven in Utah in 1964. I've never been in Utah. One black face after another coming before the screens, our television screens. And I'm thinking, conspiracy nut that I am. Conspiracy nut that I am. I'm thinking, you know, it's almost as if there's a computer program which is tracking down black voters and pulling their names off the voter registry. This is the program, part of it, and which I got out of the files. I got a CD-ROM, 2 CD-ROMs out of the files of Secretary of State Katherine Harris and her Department of Elections. Computer program, and a list. Turns out that 5 months before the election, Katherine Harris ordered county supervisors to knock off 57,000 names off the voter registries because these people were felons and they're not convicted felons and they can't vote in the state of Florida. Fair enough. If that's the rule of Florida, fine. But there was something odd about the list. I took a look at it, and I was going down the list, and this is really what I look at. This is really it. And if you look down the list, this is just, it's like, I had it cracked. It wasn't so easy. This is the other problem with investigative reporting. Someone actually has to, like, get the disc, crack the discs, all that stuff. I actually had to crack the discs for the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. I mean, I didn't do it. I had, by the way, I have volunteers, so I'm going to deputize all of you. I do need help on this. Boy, I need help. But so here's one criminal, Thomas Alvin Cooper. Thomas Alvin Cooper. You can come up and see this later if you want. I have the entire list. And what I noticed interesting thing about this evil guy Cooper is that he was convicted of a crime. He was convicted on January 30th, 2007. Yeah. And I know that I'm a conspiracy theorist. Unlike American reporters, I kind of thought that was odd. And in fact, I went through the list. I reordered the list. I had it thrown into an Excel spreadsheet, you know, nothing too fancy, and found out that there were 500 criminals of the future who lost their voting rights. You know, don't knock it. You know, Katherine Harris, you know, she's like the detective of the future. She's getting the guys before they even commit the crimes. That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. There are also 4,000 blanks. I don't know, it's hard, you can't really see it, but you come up and see it later, or buy the book. There are 4,000 blanks, blank conviction dates. Now I did something else, which is, I think, against the law in American newsrooms, which is I decided to follow up and look, and I asked for, through Freedom of Information, got the emails from email traffic from inside the Florida Department of Elections, and lo and behold, there was indeed an email from a clerk saying, you know, we're removing people who are convicted in the future. What should we do about it? And the Republican officials said, that's easy. If you blank out the name, no one will know. Blank out the date, no one will know. Oh. And it's not just a question of what they were doing. It's the color of these names. Now, if you look on this column, you'll see BLA, WHI, BLA, WHI, BLA, BLA, BLA. Notice a pattern. Florida voter registries have the race of the voter. Now this was, so it looked like a South African police roster. Now this, by the way, was required by the Voting Rights Act of '65. This is pre-computer era, when it was seen as a way to protect the black voters of Florida, who 35 years ago could get lynched for attempting to cast a ballot. But with the advent of computers and the centralization of voter rolls, it was a good way to zero in. Now, how did they zero in? By the way, of the 57,000 names, we went through them with experts. We found that at minimum, 90.2% of the people on the list were innocent of any crime. Of any crime. Were legal voters, except that they were guilty in 54% of the cases of being black or Hispanic. So you do the arithmetic, because Katherine Harris certified George Bush as the winner of the election by 537 votes. Now do the arithmetic. We figure you have 57,000 people, 90% of them are innocent, 54% of them are black. The black vote was 93% for Al Gore. The white vote was slightly for George Bush. If you do the arithmetic, you come up with, as BBC did, about 20,000 votes lost to Al Gore. Oh, okay. So obviously there was a mistake made, a fortuitous mistake, but it was a mistake which took a lot of work, because prior to this scrub list being created, there was another company which created a list, and they were paid $5,000 for that work. A company called Professional Services, $5,000 to come up with the kind of raw list of felons who were on the voter rolls. And they were fired. And they were replaced by another company. The company that got it 90%, 90.2% wrong, right? And the company that got it 90% wrong, they were paid $2 million. Now, that kind of caught my attention. Of course, it required me to look through the contracts. $2 million. Now, who was this company? This company is Choice Point of Atlanta. Their subsidiary Database Technologies, owned by Choice Point of Atlanta. Okay, remember those guys. I went to Clayton Roberts. Clayton Roberts is, whenever you see pictures of Katherine Harris, you'll see kind of this bull-necked guy, shorter than her, always standing at her side like this. That's her lawyer. He's a guy graduated from Harvard, and he started taking these low-level positions in the state of Florida. It kind of made me a little suspicious, always in some interesting spot, and he was running her Department of Elections. So I went to see Mr. Roberts, and I happened to have, it's just one of those things that fell into my hands, a document marked secret and confidential, which was a page from the contract which was left out, which was marked secret and confidential, which was, why would you have that in a state contract? What was in that page, secret and confidential? There was something interesting. It said that the company was being paid, the reason they were being paid $2 million, as opposed to $5,000, is that they were supposed to verify. They're being paid to verify these names, because this company had 20 billion data points on Americans. Keep your ears open. They had 20 million data points on Americans, so they would know if the Thomas Cooper of Orlando, Florida was the same Thomas Cooper who was convicted 20 years earlier in Ohio. There are 77 Thomas Coopers in the Florida phone book alone. So these are the guys who would know if they got the right one. And they were paid not only to look in their databases, but to make phone calls. And on that sheet it said that they're paying $2 million to manually verify by telephone. But the Florida Republicans had a very interesting list, because this list was knocking off tens of thousands of black people. Not that they're prejudiced, they just don't like the color of their vote. And they were saying, well, and so this company said, okay, you're paying us, so we're going to start making these calls, and we're going to start verifying the list. And the state of Florida said, oh no, your work is done. Thanks. Here's the check. I have a photocopy of the check for the work done, even though it says manual verification by telephone, because if they started making verification calls, they'd find out the list would be cut down by at least 90%, right? So I wanted to ask Mr. Roberts, I had a photocopy of the check for $2 million, and I had the secret confidential page of the contract in another hand, and I went to his office. I said, BBC Television would like to interview you. Yes, we sat down. It was very polite. How do you do? Da-da-da. And then I take the document marked secret and confidential, and I pull it out. Anyway, Roberts jumps up, rips off the microphone, runs into his office, slams the door on me, and calls in the state troopers to have me and my film crew taken out. I guess he had another meeting. I asked the company about the $2 million that they took. A very well-connected Republican company. And I asked them about the $2 million that they took for the telephone calls. And I said, can I have the records of your telephone calls? And they said, well, we didn't actually make telephone calls. We didn't actually have to